He just wanted to out me as a lawyer, I think was all that. So I've lived in Texas most of my life. I was born here and I've lived in Austin for over 25 years. But there was a part of my life where I lived in Detroit, Michigan. And when I lived in Detroit, I lived in a townhome, actually a co-op to be specific, that was designed by Mies van der Rohe. I've heard of Mies van der Rohe as a well-known Bauhaus architect, and not just an architect, but I think a leader in architectural and design aesthetic in the 20th century. And before I go any further, I want to thank ETS for having me here because there's no other conference where I could start a talk that way as the CEO of ERCOT, so I appreciate it. And you'll still have faith that I may actually talk about energy, so I'll try to get there. So Mies van der Rohe was very specific in his design, and I'm just going to read you something about him that I think was indicative and I actually experienced in my home. He said, Mies understood that the geometry of his building would be perfect until people got involved. Once people moved in, they would be putting ornamental things along the windowsills. They'd be hanging all sorts of different kinds of curtains, and it would destroy the geometry. So there are no windowsills. There is no place for you to put plants on the window. And that was very true. It was a beautiful place, very modern, very angular. But Mies was, this was not really yours. This was his. So what I want to talk about is the three phases of design in electricity. Those of you who get that that was a very nerdy electric joke will appreciate it. Those who don't, if you look it up later, you'll understand just how nerdy we can be. First phase, design for the designer. Like Mies, I think when we developed a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the industry of the 20th century, they were marvels. The electric grid is an unprecedented design marvel, and it is useful to every single person who comes near it. But in the old days, the electric grid didn't belong to you. You were a user, but you needed to stay away from it. Not just because it was unsafe, which is still a good idea, not to get too close to parts of it, but because it wasn't really yours. It was designed by the designers and run by a central entity that kept it for you, and that's all you needed to know about it. Well, then we moved into what I'll call phase two, which wasn't really started in electricity, certainly, but user-centered design came next in the evolution of design generally, where the central designer, like a Mies van der Rohe, people realized could be replaced, was maybe not necessary. And when technology developed, we began to see much more of this user-centered design. So what do I mean by that? Dieter Rams was a designer at Braun who made coffee makers, who designed beautiful, practical, everyday appliances. Dieter Rams ended up being the inspiration for people like Johnny Ive, for the people who designed things from the MacBook to your iPhone to the Nest thermostat, as you just heard about. And user-centered design had some pretty specific principles. And let me just go over a couple of those. Dieter Rams wrote something called the 10 Principles of Design. And just to share a couple, one was, good design is as little design as possible. Less, but better. Because it concentrates on the essential aspects, and the products are not burdened with non-essentials. Back to purity, back to simplicity. That's why the 2-year-old at the table next to you can use the iPhone without your assistance. It's simple. It's no more design than necessary. And as we began to change energy markets, you can hear echoes of that sort of principle in some of the thinkers in the energy design world. One of our board members, named Peter Crampton, is an economist, University of Maryland, and a consultant, has done a tremendous amount of work and thinking on not only principles of design and energy, but also things like the auctions for spectrum and other very complicated quantitative problems. Peter wrote early on in the design of energy period that market design should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. That's as far as we should go. And that's, in a way, what a lot of people in the energy markets have tried to make. So what does that have to do with ERCOT, with Texas? Well, I'd posit to you that SB7, which is the state legislation that opened the market in Texas and created the modern ERCOT market, in some sense, came along in 1999 and in some sense could be considered an example of user-centered design, appropriate to its time. And I don't just mean users by consumers. I mean, in the old days, in the day of, design for designers, the only industries I was aware of that called their customers users were utilities and drug dealers. But that began to change. But I'm not just talking about users like consumers. As technology developed in generation, people could do things with generation on their own industrial sites that they couldn't do before. People could do things with IT technology that they couldn't do before. And they demanded a change in systems to take advantage of those opportunities. And what happened in Texas was that demand was taken up, and we have retail electric providers. 75% of the ERCOT region is served by competitive retail electric providers. We have municipal utilities. We have user-owned cooperatives who continue to maintain the business models that they had. But even with those business models, generation was separated and dispatched by the grid operator. And we saw tremendous investment in new types of generation. So the system changed in a way that recognized the technology and recognized that the market needed something new. And at this point, in some ways, while we have over 1,000 pages of market rules, which are hard to call simple, still, the ERCOT market attempts to reflect that the best we can. We have a day-ahead market. We have a real-time market. There are a lot of bilateral transactions. We have a basically stock market, the FTRs or CRRs as we call them, congestion reservation rights, and we're an energy-only market. I ran into a guy from New York at the National Energy Marketers Association conference. It's a conference mainly of people who do retail all over the country. And we didn't know each other, and we're chatting over coffee at the conference, and he says, well, where are you from anyway? And I said, well, I'm at ERCOT. He goes, oh, ERCOT, I don't think much about you guys. You guys are simple. Now, I took that to mean elegant, of course, which is actually what he meant. I don't think about you guys. You're easy to do business with. You're easy to interface with. We're not in a fight over everything because that's how we're set up. That's how this market was constructed. But I'd say now we're entering, or we're well into, the third phase of design in electricity, and it won't be the last, but because what we're seeing and what you've been hearing a whole lot about is things that require, and I'm going to steal a phrase from a guy named Peter Slavin. I can give you the citation to the article because I'm just basically lifting the rest of my speech from his article. He's an associate professor at the MIT Media Lab. But Peter Slavin talks about this term of design as participation. So what are you talking about? Well, today we're addressing a different kind of energy system, and you've been hearing about it for 2.5 days. We have generation that is not only there to produce power, but it's aspirational. Walmart, Google, Amazon, whomever wants to put wind power on the ERCOT grid, not because they don't have enough power, but because they want to be responsible for putting wind power on a system. Similarly with solar, there are aspirations people have about what our energy system should look like that are being incorporated into grids and markets in a way that they weren't before. Companies didn't ask for a particular kind of generation because they thought it was cool. In Mises' time, we're dealing with things that are beginning to blur lines. In the electric industry, it could always be pretty clear that there's load and there's generation, right? There's demand and there's supply. Now we're seeing things like storage. Blur those lines. Sometimes it's demand, sometimes it's supply. Similarly with electric cars, electric vehicles. Sometimes they're demand and sometimes they're supply on the system. And how do we work with that? Even some transmission assets now have the ability to operate in a way that you could basically characterize as supply or demand. We're seeing a merchant DC tie project in Texas, it's proposed. It's at the commission, PUC is finishing up its order on, that from the ERCOT system perspective, that's what it looks like. So we're contending with different things in that way, and we're contending with petabytes, not terabytes anymore. There's probably something beyond petabytes now, but petabytes of data generated by advanced metering systems, and we have over 7 million advanced meters in Texas. About 98% of the load in Texas comes in on 15-minute meter data. That data is extremely valuable. There's synchrophasers are developing on our systems, which are giving, from an operational perspective, us an ability to gather information in milliseconds. That, right now we're looking at events in the past and trying to figure out what we can see from synchrophaser data. As those technologies advance, we may be able to use them in planning and in day ahead in real time. And they generate enormous amounts of data. And that data is extremely valuable to people in the business, both for operational perspective and from a business planning perspective. And it's also very valuable to cyber criminals who'd really like to get at it. So we're in the context of, a very sort of intense set of changes, and mainly it's change in its complexity and its interaction of things. And I'm going to read you something else. It's a book I like by Sidney Decker, wrote a book called Drift into Failure, where he says, the growth of complexity in society has outpaced our understanding of how complex systems work and fail. Our technologies have got ahead of our theories. We're able to build things whose properties we understand in isolation, but in competitive, regulated societies, their connections proliferate, their interactions and interdependencies multiply, and complexities mushroom. So what are we going to do? As I would suggest 3 things, and just suggestions. One is, don't forget the design principles of the past. For example, one of Rams's other principles of design was, good design is thorough down to the last detail. Nothing must be arbitrary or left to chance. Care and accuracy in the design process show respect towards the consumer. That sounds like how we've been running high reliability organizations like grid operators since the beginning. Don't forget those principles. Mies van der Rohe designed my townhouse in a very different period, an extremely different context, but he was a master. You should remember that. Number 2, you need to design in flexibility. You need to expect or demand transparency and lead with security. How do we deal with wind integration and solar integration on our grid? We tinker, we see evidence, we act on it, we create tools, because we have to maintain safety on the system. That's our central function, our central job. But in order to tinker, in order to be nimble, you have to build systems with flexibility. You have to build rules with flexibility, because we don't really know what we're building them for. And we have to understand that. That kind of gets to my 3rd suggestion. Be humble, or expect to be humbled. I'm going to read one more thing from my friend Peter Slavin. The designers of complex adaptive systems are not strictly designing systems themselves. They're hinting those systems towards anticipated outcomes from an array of existing interrelated systems. These are designers that do not understand themselves to be in the center of the system. Rather, they understand themselves to be participating, shaping the systems that interact with other forces, ideas, events, and other designers. And there could not have been better evidence of that than what you just saw before I came up. A software design company that makes meters in interaction, in partnership, in dialogue with a utility. There are lots more people participating in this than have traditionally. And those who are coming in new need to understand that we got to keep it safe and we got to keep it secure, and everybody's relying on us. And those who've come to it from a long time ago got to understand it's moving, whether you like it or not. And most everybody who's been in it for a while has been seeing that for quite some time and is accustomed to it. So as we move into my 3rd phase, there's many old and new participants in the future design of reliable and efficient electricity delivery, and I'll just tell you, ERCOT's proud to be among us. So thanks.
I had a question for you about your interest in architecture. Where did that come from?
I like how it looks. I don't know. I mean, I find environments have a big impact on how we feel. And I think that's just one of those things, if you're open to your experience of your life, you start to understand that it makes a difference where you are and how you interact with it. For example, I learned when I was in my 20s that although it was super cool at the time and still is, I never want to work in a building that has exposed brick walls. I can't tell you why. It's taste, it's aesthetics, but it makes a big difference in our lives.
Thank you, Bill.
Sure, my pleasure.